Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Rockwell, and I'm the director of the Cool Institute for Advanced Study, which is hosting this Around the World Symposium on Digital Culture. I'd like to welcome you to the University of Alberta panel that is part of this 17-hour event. We started at about 6 a.m. with Virginia, and then Trinity College Dublin, Brazil, and now we have a 2-hour panel here at the University of Alberta. The Cool Institute is committed to sustainable research on a global scale. We're experimenting with ways to use the internet to connect Alberta to the world, and this is our latest project. This symposium is, I hope, the first of an annual event. We're thrilled to have partners from around the world: Japan, Australia, Brazil, the United States, Ireland, and we hope to work with these partners to build this into a truly inclusive and global event. For those of you who are just tuning in, this event, as I mentioned before, started early this morning and will be continuing until about 10 p.m. Mountain Time, when we have the University of Western Sydney from Australia coming in what is actually the 31st of May, not the 30th. So for many people it is spanning 2 days. There are many people that I'd like to thank. First of all, I want to thank the Arts Resource Center, who has done a lot of the difficult work organizing this. Claire Peters organized and managed the video conferencing, and we've had, from the last count, we've had on the actual streaming video server, we've had about 252 people getting the video stream, and at any one point we have, right around now, we have about 32 people in addition to the people that are in this room listening in to the stream. I also hope that we'll actually, because all this video will be archived and organized, I think we'll see a much larger global audience for all of these talks as people come in later on and access the talks at their convenience. I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to also thank Grant Wang, who shot our pre-recorded video and is our videographer right now. I'd like to thank Dr. Justine Gill, who's been the project manager of this project. Without her, this would not have happened. She has been spending months coordinating, talking to people, gently poking people to send in their video and to agree what's going to happen, what isn't going to happen. She's been assisted by a number of us. Melania Ruyani has been helping with a lot of the technical work on the website. And of course, the coordinator of the Cool Institute, Oliver Rossier, has been doing a lot of work, especially around media relations, and he's been tweeting and so on. One last mention, who saved our bacon late last night, Kamal Ranawira from the Arts Resource Center. He helped set up the website and set up the plugins. And last night, when our server went down at about 11:30, he was the person who yanked the appropriate chains to get it back up. These types of timely events I'm sure anyone who's worked on one of these will know that they're very stressful, and we're very fortunate to have fabulous support here. The panel here at the University of Alberta includes 3 colleagues interested in different aspects of digital culture. They will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a conversation. I'll be asking questions that we developed together, so there are no surprises. I'm going to introduce our speakers first, and then they will each give their short talks. First, we'll have Dr. Julie Rack, who is a professor in the Department of English and Film Studies. With Anna Poletti, she has put together a collection titled Identity Technologies, Constructing the Self Online, which should be coming out soon. Dr. Ofer Arazi is an associate professor in business, in the School of Business and Information Systems, and he conducts research into how technology and affordances enable new forms of organizations. And Dr. Maureen Engel is the graduate coordinator of our Masters in Humanities Computing program here. And if any of you are listening in and thinking, wow, I'd like to do a Masters in Digital Humanities, this is the place to do it. And she's the one to talk to. She's a co-investigator in the Edmonton Pipelines project that's interested in deep narratives and deep mapping. In short, we have speakers who are interested in identity, organizations, and space in the digital age. So I'm going to turn it over to to you, Dr. Wright.
Okay, I'd really like to thank Jeffrey Rockwell, my colleague, for inviting me to be part of the symposium. I'm excited that I get to talk to you from one position in the world to so many places in the world. What I want to talk to you about actually comes from the introduction that I co-wrote with Anna Paletti in the book that's coming out pretty soon, Identity Technologies. When we did that book, what we wanted to do was to talk a bit together and then to have other people speak with us about the big issues to do with online identity. So not just examples, we're not just talking about, you know, specific even kinds of software, we're really talking about the big ideas to do with what identity is and whether being online is changing how we understand ourselves. So what I'm going to read to you, and hopefully as lively a way as I can, is from that introduction where we set up that work. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why study personal identity anyway in the context of online living. It is now commonplace to assume that personal identity work is foundational to the production of social media and even of hardware interfaces. There are many possible reasons for this. One reason involves the connection of Web 2.0 with its insistence on digital forms of participation between individuals to liberal ideas of subjectivity. Internet subjects can be many things. They can be citizens, consumers, participants, gamers, lurkers, or stalkers, for instance. But generally, the conditions of internet subjectivity remain indebted to classic liberalism. This isn't about the Liberal Party of Canada or any other place. We're really talking about the idea of liberalism here. Internet users understand themselves to be individuals who are unique, have agency, and exhibit commonly understood forms of consciousness, as discussed, for instance, in the pioneering work on this question by Helen Kennedy. Arguably, the structure of the internet works to support this understanding of identity, which originated in Europe, spread via various forms of print culture, and became part of Western ideas about what the self is. These assumptions about the subject have continued to travel via the grammar of internet interfaces worldwide. Moreover, if these conditions of selfhood are not present, then there are usually traces of active resistance to normative internet culture present as well. I've done other work on that in an essay called The Digital Queer, which you can download for free from the internet if you want to look. Therefore, the study of online activity does need to take into account ideas about what identity is, how it is formed, and how stories about identity are made. According to a philosopher from hundreds of years ago now, John Locke, who was the inventor of the contemporary concept of identity, identity is the following. It's the expression of consciousness, which is continuous over time. And you can understand that easily, right? You were who you were as a child, and you now are an adult, and you make a narrative, a story about yourself that connects those things. But Locke said something else. He said that identity is also a product, one's own property, which is a legal entity. So identity as we understand it today is both the process of knowing oneself, right, by an interplay of differences and similarities. I'm not like Jeffrey, Jeffrey's not like me, that's how I know what I'm like, for instance. While at the same time, it's also about knowing one's social place due to a host of technologies outside of yourself. And those technologies authenticate and delimit your existence. Some of those technologies include one of the earliest forms where the word identity was used in the modern world, identity cards, and also later dog tags, or, more important for this discussion, PIN numbers. In a similar way, Mark Poster thinks about the possibility of identity theft as a shift in our understanding of what identity is. The possibility of identity theft underscores what Locke says. Identity is personal property because it can be stolen. But it also challenges other ideas from Locke and from later psychoanalysis about identity as a process of self-incorporation. Let me show you what I mean. If identity can be stolen, then the process of identity formation isn't unique to individuals, right? So Poster says, by information media, identity is transforming into something that captures individuality, but it also exists in terms of external traces. In other words, you are your data. right? You don't exist apart from your data. That's what he's saying. So how can identity be this expression of inner self-processing and the result of identification? Where does agency begin and end? If you are your data, what are you? As more and more people use electronic banking, engage in online commercial transactions, and communicate with each other in an online setting alone, the idea of identity as property, as well as one's essence, is put under increasing pressure. Identity theft has, for this reason, been called the quintessential crime of the information age. And there I'm quoting because it highlights the fact that the term identity now refers both to consciousness and to media content. If we are the sum total of our data, and if our data is not only indicative of a self, but also symbolic of what we possess, then our existence becomes precarious, since data, unlike memories, can be relatively easily taken from us and used in ways that we didn't intend. So I tend to agree that with Mark Poster that this understanding of identity hasn't been explored very much yet. And so that's one reason why I'm floating it for you in the panel. So let me move on to another aspect of what identity is, okay? One thing we could do if we understand identity as a product as well as a process is we can ask what the products of identity are and whether they're part of late capitalist circulations of goods or not. And we can find out who produces and who consumes certain kinds of identities online. The study of online production involves many kinds of analysis, which must include what a producer makes or codes, what the affordances of the representation are. It is just as important to understand, for instance, how advertisements work to disrupt the idea of the internet as a public or democratic space, for example. You have to pay attention to everything that we see on the internet, not just some things. As Philippe Lejeune has pointed out, and this is quite a bit previous to the way we understand the internet now, but I think it's prescient. He says, new communication tools are not only changing our life stories, the expressions of a life, they are also attacking life itself. What he means is that new communication tools, and he means online things, are changing how we understand how fast someone should live. And they multiply how many media registers are available to many of us to communicate things about our lives to others. The result, Lejeune says, might be a breakdown of what he calls narrative identity, that sense of yourself having a story through time, since the speed of technology means that the development of the idea of a life cannot depend on older ideas of what the past and the future for an individual might be like. Whether or not technology succeeds in breaking down older ideas about the self, Lejeune's observation does signal that the idea of narrative may not fit what identity formation looks like in digital media, and we may have to look to other ways to think about what is happening. Finally, I'm just going to say a couple of things about celebrity discourse, and I'm done. For example, when we talk about celebrity, the proliferation of self-representation in digital media has the effect of making anyone into a celebrity. I actually have discussed this with my students, and they are finding this out, that they actually have to manage their images that appear online now that they're older, you know, and they're not 16 and at a party and putting things on social media. And so they are actually having to act like celebrities who have to exercise that kind of image control, and that they're not used to doing it. So the internet does this. So what is celebrity? It's a cultural construction where the representation of your person becomes a commodity that is traded legally or is stolen. Celebrity in the United States, which is where the concept first developed, necessitated the development of privacy law, which conflated the images of a person with that person so that the person could exert control over what was produced. And that happened as the Hollywood star system developed. Privacy law was created because public identities within capitalism through celebrity were coded as threats. So people were trying to take your image without your permission, right? So this actually changed in the US what being a person was legally. The development of digital forms of identity production and circulation has followed a similar path. As Lynn Lopucky has said, the existence of capitalist forms of identity production, such as the concept of the individual consumer, has eroded the idea of online public identity. In the process, this operation has created what she calls a micropolitics based on secrecy maintained by the use of passwords or the granting of access, which is very much like what it is to be a celebrity, and you only give certain people access to you. Online identities then become closely guarded things rather than processes, and that can be stolen or misrepresented, and you have to protect against it. The casting of identities as properties under constant threat necessitates the increase of security and its inevitable failure as the controls are breached, as they always are. That can even result in a neoliberal interpretation of citizenship as the assumption of individual responsibility for security. We all have to keep safe by ourselves. But the anxieties about security are actually caused by the existence of the idea of privacy itself. That's what Lopaki says. So the operations of online living within late capitalism are beginning to result in changes to ideas about how security, citizenship, and identity itself are understood. So I hope that in my brief tour here, that there are some issues that have arisen for you, and I look forward very much to a worldwide conversation about these and other issues to do with identity. Thank you. That felt funny.
Over.
Virtual.
So thank you, Jeffrey, and the other organizing for inviting me to this panel. And I'm going to talk about a different aspect of the internet revolution that somehow is related to the notion of privacy and identity, but not directly. And my interest is in how the internet affected production. Maybe not a surprise given my background as an industrial engineer. And when I talk about production, I'm mostly focused on knowledge-based products, knowledge-based goods, the kind of goods that we can pack as a file. So whether these are books or movies or software, designs, reports. And these goods are produced both within the borders of traditional organizations, but this is not where my focus is. So my focus is what happens outside the traditional organizational borderlines, where communities create software and movies and music and books and so on. So there are different terms that refer to this phenomena: peer production, online production, communities. Benter talks about the community-based model, social production, but they all describe the same basic thing. And when we talk about production, you think about the traditional narrative of competition, survival of the fittest, control. Now we're talking about a shift of paradigm. Instead of competition, there's cooperation. Instead of survival of the fittest, there's collective action. Instead of control as the main way of inducing action, we're talking about intrinsic motivations and people just doing it because it's fun, because they're interested, they want to get engaged in a project. And just some examples to give you a sense of how big this phenomena is. Starting with open source software development, I'm sure that many people are familiar with the notion of open source, but for those who are not, this is when a group of people outside the organization volunteer to come and work together to create code. And when you think about it, you say, what is the chances that this kind of product will be at the same quality as the kind of products produced by Microsoft and Oracle and Sun and other companies? This is just one example of the market share for web servers. And there are many, many different types of products that are produced by through open source databases and scripting languages and spreadsheets and WordPress and so on. But just looking at web servers, what do you think is the market share of open source project Apache versus the Microsoft? Let's say yes.
Apache has 60%.
Apache has controls the market share with recent figures, May 2013, 54% of the market share. Microsoft under 17%. So,
Under 17.
Okay, so how can this work? If I told you in a different environment, let's say, producing cars, a bunch of engineers come and work in their garages in the evening and produce cars that are completely Toyota, that have the lion's share of the market. Doesn't sound reasonable. Right? And this is just one example of many different types of products. Wikipedia is another example, one of the most popular sites of the internet, produced solely by volunteers that organized. Other examples, Project Gutenberg, you can see the slide here, where volunteers digitize books, mainly books that are in the public domain and other cultural artifacts. Citizen science projects, where volunteers, citizens participate in making of science. One example is the Galaxy Zoo, where volunteers, see this on the slide here, they tag images, they analyze images and tag images produced by NASA's telescopes. And there are many, many other types of citizen science projects. If you go to the other URL, that is the Zooniverse, which is a collection of many different types of projects. And you can see the, I don't know how clearly we can see the web page here, but the different categories of projects. So this phenomenon is definitely big and it's growing. You know, some people have argued this is going to be the primary engine of wealth creation within a few years. Maybe that's a little far-fetched, but definitely is a main engine of wealth creation. And what is common to all of these different types of projects? The contributors are mostly volunteers, not only, but mostly volunteers, and in many cases non-experts. In terms of the organization, these are self-organizing communities, egalitarian, non-hierarchical, decentralized, at least to a large extent. Now, in terms of research and organizational research into this area, one of the key, and people have begun looking at this phenomena the past 10 years or so, and what is clear is that the existing theories that explain how people work in groups do not apply directly to these kind of projects. Just take, for example, theories of group development, where group people come together, they create shared norms, and they agree on procedures, and then they become productive later on, and then the group assembles. Take, for example, Wikipedia. Well, the project started one day, but a person can come and participate and leave the project at any time. Norming happens throughout, the project is endless, so clearly existing theories do not apply, and there's a need to come up with different theories, but group development is just one example. Think of leadership and other aspects, coordination, and so on. Okay. I'm going to very briefly just highlight some of the questions that existing research is looking at. I don't think that we have answers just yet, just some of the key questions in explaining how these kind of projects work. And some projects are extremely successful. Wikipedia is one example, but other projects fail. So what makes some projects successful, and how do you get, if you want to create a peer production projects, what do you need to do? So some of the key questions, the first one is motivation, right? What draws people in the first place to come and join, and how do we ensure continued participation so people don't, so there's no attrition over time. Another question pertains to expertise and resources. So given that everyone can contribute, how do we ensure the quality of the product? And there's different takes on it. There's some projects that try to combine peer production with expert involvement, but definitely the notion of expertise and to what extent you allow non-experts to play a role is a key issue. Another issue is governance. So given the lack of centralized controls, how do you organize work? How do you decide who does what? What about conflict resolution and quality control? You know, these aspects, how do you organize work? And what you'll find is that the lack of centralized control does not mean that there's no coordination at all. In fact, if you look underneath Wikipedia, for example, you see a comprehensive bureaucratic structure with norms and procedures not very different from other types of organizations that we see. Another issue, intellectual property. Okay, who controls, what are the schemes for managing intellectual property? And lastly, the role of IT or IT affordances in enabling these kinds of projects, pre-production projects. Do we see differences between projects that are based on different IT platforms? What kind of changes do we need to make to the IT platform to make the projects more effective and more successful? So these are the kind of questions that I and other people are looking at. I don't have answers just yet, but it's the beginning of answers. That summarizes my presentation. Thank you.
So I want to thank Jeffrey too for inviting me to be part of something that I think is
is actually really cool and hopefully gets a lot of traction. It's a really interesting idea, and I'm really happy to be a first instantiation of it. So that's sweet. Thanks, Jeffrey. I want to talk about two main things today that I hope can help encourage kind of further reflection and analysis about the place of digital maps and digital mapping in our understanding of digital culture. So we've had people, we've had products, so now we're going to have places. So first I'm going to provide a few short observations just about Google Maps. And then I'm going to propose a couple of theoretical tools that I think can really help us to understand what's at stake in the development and deployment of digital mapping technologies, because I think it's something we really need to pay attention to quite closely. So first of all, I'm always shocked by the fact that Google Maps went live in 2005. Okay? 2005, seriously. So the speed and extent to which geographic and locative technologies have infiltrated our everyday lives is kind of staggering, right? We are now literally a mouse click away from being able to see anywhere on Earth except for the poles, right? Google Maps only goes to 85 degrees. Want to zoom in on the border between North Korea and China? Done. Want to find the hotel you'll be staying at when you go to your next conference? Done. Want to see the building that we're actually holding this session in right now? Just type in Old Arts Building, University of Alberta. Bang, you'll get that. None of that was possible. None of it was possible 8 years ago, right? That's crazy. So the technology of Google Maps, it's also changed significantly even just over that 8-year window, right? So satellite imagery was integrated in 2007. In 2006. 2007 saw the integration of My Maps and Street View in the United States. Street View came to Canada in 2011. 2010 saw the inclusion of 45-degree high-resolution aerial imagery. That's a 5-year development window that I just described, right? So within 5 years, the idea of what constitutes a map was actually immeasurably changed, right? The combination of the level of visual detail that it could contain and the almost 180-degree angle that it afforded us to look at, right, changed completely what a map actually is, right? So maps have always been abstractions of space, right, that nonetheless propose a kind of truth claim, right? But as previously unimaginable levels of detail become the norm and expectation in the Google Map world, I think that we lose any sense of the map as an abstraction, right? We only exist with the map as a truth claim. So if Google, theoretically, made it possible for us to know everything, Google Maps made it possible for us to know everywhere, right? Or that's the myth, at least, right? Right. Because, of course, the map, or more importantly, the image as map, right, because that's actually what we're talking about, tricks us into believing that it's just simply and straightforwardly true. So if you Google mapped our Old Arts Building here, what you're going to see there is the high-resolution 45-degree aerial view. If you're feeling particularly curious, you might want to go down to the street view in front of the building. And that's actually, probably more accurately, we should call that the path view, right? Since on campuses there aren't actually roads that the Google, Ms. Google woman can come into, right? So if you're feeling particularly curious, you might go down to the street view. And you might even decide that you want to look up at those windows on the second floor, right? That are actually what we're looking out of right now, right? But of course, we're not looking at those windows right now, but we are, right? So the best part, though, to me, of this Google Map view, those in the room will appreciate it, those online might. You might notice it's never winter in it, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's a really easy example, but I think it's a really, really important reminder, right, of just how much of an abstraction this really is, right? It's never winter in Edmonton. So what I want to argue here is actually that digital maps are emerging structures of representation. And as cultural critics, we really need to analyze them as such. We need to ask what these new forms give us to think, what they include. We need to ask what stories they tell, and what stories we want them to tell. We need to know and understand that there's a really important difference between those two things. So my position is that one of the fundamental ways that we can understand the new functions and affordances of the map is by having a deep understanding of what we actually mean by space. So I just want to quickly propose 4 theorists, it's like a greatest hits tour, who provide what I think of as crucial enabling tools for that understanding, because they provide a framework for moving beyond space as a purely metaphorical concept on the one hand, and a purely physical one on the other hand. So I'm going to start with Michel Foucault, who claimed in Of Other Spaces that the great obsession of the 19th century was, as we know, history. But the present epoch will perhaps, above all, be the epoch of space. So for Foucault, the prioritization of space was a direct result of his contention that we're living in the epoch of simultaneity. So in contrast to the convention of linearity in historical narratives, what he called the long life developing through time, an analysis of space instead allows us to recognize that we experience the world as, and these are Foucault's words, a network that connects points and intersects with its own skein. So I find the metaphor of the skein actually really enabling in this sense, right? Imagine a skein of yarn. It's a densely packed space that contains a highly organized thread, one that you can hold, pull, eventually unraveling the whole thing, and yet that whole long thread is contained in this compact space, right, that appears to have no sense to it at all, and yet, of course, does. So using the metaphor of the skein, we can actually imagine how space is not actually an alternative to time, but actually a container for time, and a container for all time, right? So time can actually cease to be linear. So following from Foucault, Henri Lefebvre initiates a significant theoretical challenge with the production of space in 1974, a work that in many ways enacted and literalized the metaphorical notion of space, network, and simultaneity that Foucault proposed. For Lefebvre, in order to animate a theoretical concept like space, it needed first to be freed from its rigid geometrical history in the field of mathematics, its status as physical space, but also its purely conceptual and entirely imprecise status as mental space that we get from the field of philosophy. So instead, Lefebvre coins a third term, social space, an analytic category that proposes that space is never empty. It is produced by social actions, and it has to be read and analyzed as a social production. Michel de Certeau, of course, in the practice of everyday life, demonstrates one method for enacting social space by walking the city, right? So for de Certeau, structures like government, commerce, and institutions deploy what he calls strategies, right? That are designed to construct, manage, and control the space of the city. Conversely, individuals within that space, perhaps holding on to their identities, right? They navigate via what de Certeau calls tactics, right? So these are short-term pragmatic actions that defy the logic and control of the strategies. Tactics produce social space, right? To link de Certeau back to Lefebvre. So while strategies are visible to de Certeau as he writes this from the 110th floor of the World Trade Center looking down on Manhattan, what I think of as the satellite view, tactics, rather, are enacted at the street level, right? What I think of as street view. Everyday interruptions that defy and ignore that view from the top. So the last person that I want to talk about is Lucy Lippert, who is an art historian by trade. And what Lippert does is she gives us a language to actually describe the affective relations that turn what she names space, which she thinks of as the abstractive quantitative physicality of a location, into the lived, meaningful, and aesthetic experience that she names place. So she says, if place is where culture is lived, if space is where culture is lived, then place is the result of their union. So she argues that place, and this is a quote, is latitudinal and longitudinal within the map of a person's life. It is temporal and spatial, personal and political, a layered location replete with human histories and memories. Place has depth as well as width. It is about connections, what surrounds it, what formed it, what happened there, and what will happen there. So taking these 4 theories together, I hope, and armed with a fuller and more complex theoretical understanding of what we might mean by space, I hope we can resist seeing digital maps as merely indexical representations, and instead grapple with them as meaningful ones. Like all texts, maps tell particular stories, they hold particular values, and they neglect others. And like texts, those stories can be read, analyzed, and, for me at least, most importantly, told. Google Maps tells us a rather singular story. I think we need to make maps that can tell us the others. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so we finished the presentations, and now we're going to have more of a conversation. And I encourage people, both here in the room, to ask questions, and people online to feel free to ask questions. I've got Twitter up in front of me here. If you ask a question with the hashtag U of A World, it will hopefully come up, and I can try to pose it, weave it into the questions that we prepared. And I think Oliver is also going to help me with any questions that are coming up. So I'm going to start with a very basic question, which is, who are we on the internet? How does the internet change how we present ourselves?
I'll start, but I better not finish. I don't think you can finish that question. Well, I think there are a couple of things to think about here. One is that, what does the internet do to us? Okay, so in here, really, I'm not the person on this panel to talk about affordances, but I think that it is a good place to start. When we think about how things are designed so that we can use them, think about how online life is designed so that we can live it, right? And what is possible or thinkable. In that sense, it is ultimate, in a different, not quite this game, but a little bit like that, where what we think of as the possible, or what we think of as okay behavior, for instance, community behavior, that is all in part of our design. It's the way that we're thinking about it. So I tend to think of that as not that different from offline life. When you walk down the street, let's say, in the offline world, there are certain stores you go into and certain stores you don't in a corporate environment. And the same thing happens online. We're just not used to understanding ourselves that way, in that sense. But affordances help create that sense of ourselves in space and time. And so I tend to think there are differences, but they're not as different as we think they are. So anyway, I think the other panelists have got a lot to say, so I'm going to pass it off.
You want me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things when we think about how identity works online is to recognize the fullness of what that means, right? I mean, I think this is one of the really interesting things that Julie, you were getting at in your talk, is that it's not just individual expression, it's not just how we express ourselves. Mm-hmm. That constitutes an identity. That there are a lot of other things that work. So to bring it back to space, because that's what I like to do, but also because I think that's what I'm expected to do. But to imagine that we imagine ourselves in relation to a space that is constituted for us visually in these really particular ways, that influences our self-knowledge, our sense of ourself, and our sense of where we are in the world, right? And that's a component of that identity. So the idea of how identity works online, I think, is far deeper and far more complicated than the idea of, a Facebook update, or what we say about ourselves, or what we might say in discussion forums, right? But it's really about how we are formed, right? How our subjectivity is formed by the structures that we interact with, right? In that environment, and those are far more complicated than straightforward self-expression.
Yeah, I think we're really just beginning to understand the depth that we have to go to be able to figure out who we are online. I think it's a huge question that you're asking. Mm-hmm. In that sense. Yeah. Like, are we ethical online? It would be like that. If we are ethical beings, if we have online life that's separate from offline life, what is our ethics? How do we treat others in the world? How is the world even operating? And I think half the time we're not even sure. So this is a really good start.
Well, you certainly think a lot about affordances.
I have to agree with Julie that in essence, as human beings, there's no fundamental difference between our offline and our online activities. We have identity and we have social interactions. The affordances of technologies allow us to extend those in certain ways. I think when you look at identity, maybe the one big difference is the ability to manage multiple identities. It's not so much my self-identity, it's more about what I present to others, right? In some sites I log in anonymously and make some contributions, posted anonymously. In others I use one identity, in other settings different identities. And this is becoming much more complex. It's not so much about the self-identity, it's more about managing. You talk about everybody being a celebrity.
Yeah.
And what we choose to present in different settings. This is because technology allows us to hide and take on different masks and different settings much more easily than before, and that makes things more complex and more interesting.
Do you feel that we're limited by the handles, the affordances that we have at our disposal? Can you imagine, different types of affordances you'd like to have? I'll give you an example from, like many people, I feel email is just out of control. It's no longer a handle. It's like a rapidly descending escalator that I'm madly trying to run up. And, and in fact, while we're talking, more email is flooding in, and it's just been making me more anxious. Are there? Can you think of ways that we can build better handles?
I'm going to give you an example from the past because we can see this problem clearly from over 150 years ago. I have a friend who did a really great paper on the history of the fire escape. In the Victorian era in Britain, people imagined that what technology did was that it moved you around. So fire escapes were designed so that you would go into a basket and you would be lowered. Okay? The problem was, by the time you got lowered, you would have burned to death. So there was a problem with design. The problem wasn't really the design, though. It was how people understood their bodies. Who were they in the world, right? Well, you get moved around. That's what's supposed to happen. You don't move away from the fire. Something helps you move away. And eventually, somebody went, this isn't working. This isn't working at all. We have bodies. We can move away from the fire. So we need to build a fire escape that lets you do that, right? And if you see old fire escapes in older cities like New York City, you'll see these steps that get lowered, right? They mechanically lowered. And they're Victorian. They were from the idea that you don't jump off. You wait for something to be lowered. So your metaphor of the escalator is interesting. That was designed to move people, but you're using it as a way to talk about how information is moving regardless of what you want to do with it.
I think you're referring to information overload.
Yeah.
Right, or what I call the cognitive pollution. So, in the old world, knowledge was an asset, or was a key resource in the Greek and Egyptian god of knowledge. Now knowledge is everywhere. The key resource is the ability to limit and filter the amounts of information. So, but affordances, one of the things that the internet allows us is to get access to all of this richness of information. One thing you talk about, what could be changed, or imagine that you have kind of a switch where you can define the pipe that goes with this pipe includes everything, email and news and everything. You can say, okay, this is how much I want to get a day. I want to get more, and then you have the tools to load the more relevant information. That's the key. Right now, we have no control over that switch, right? Aside from turning off the computer.
Well, I wasn't going to say this, but Google just announced today that they're piloting a new kind of filter for their inbox, right? Which will be a tabbed inbox that automatically filters things according to like particular criteria, which is one kind of affordance that tries to account for what you're describing, right? Which is this kind of overload of email, but. It doesn't take the step back, I think, to speak to the more important question of whether or not something is actually an appropriate tool for the job that we're asking it to do, right? And I think that's actually That's actually the problem of ordinances that we run into right now, is that we habitually use tools because we habitually use them, and not because they're necessarily good at what we want them to do, right? So there are lots of cases where email is an excellent tool for what we want it to do, but there are actually way more cases where it's actually a lousy tool, right? It takes far longer than, like, you know, a 30-second phone conversation or face-to-face running into each other in the hallway, or whatever, right? So the idea of like what, I think one of the things that we're not very good at is knowing which tool to use for which job, right? So, you know, we're using hammers on everything.
This gets back to Julie's point about we're all celebrities. We're all having to learn to manage our time, our information, our public presence. One thing that has intrigued me that's happening recently is this whole life tracking phenomenon. As we get more and more devices that measure, that we can use to sort of watch ourselves and something like that. So I was wondering what you guys think about these life tracking websites, tools, toys, and so on like that.
I used to be really old-fashioned about this stuff and think, oh, life tracking, who cares? This is just management of the self, you know. But, and I have to say, if he's out there somewhere, and he probably is, Mac Mail, the self-described biggest blogger in Edmonton, if he's out there, is an absolutely unrepentant life tracker. And he convinced me that there was a value to sharing the information. For me, this is something that I think is actually an older trend. So when televisions first came into public use, right, anybody could have a television. The idea that it was a device that was foreign that came into your house was invasive. So televisions were designed to look like other things. They were designed to look like furniture, right? Which is why my television had a fake wood grain when I was growing up. You know the ones, black and white, those ones with dials. 20-somethings, that's how old I am, dials. So, you know, but those were made that way because it was too invasive, even back then. So now we're in that same situation, right? So we're still thinking of information as a flood that we either hold back or we welcome it and it takes over completely. I'm wondering if we could conceive of ourselves differently with respect to information. I'm wondering what you guys would think about any of that.
I'd love dials, especially those big ones that click.
Everybody loves dials.
Up to channel 13.
Well, you know, Oprah's idea of, you know, dial it down. I don't want to know my weight today.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No. You were about to say
You know, I'm so old school with technologies. I like to look at their impact, but in terms of adopting technologies, this seems to me, at least from personal perspective, something that is a little bit difficult to relate the life tracking, but people are adopting it. Intrusive technologies.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, people find themselves fascinating. They always have, right? I mean, this is, you know, it's another reason why people are fascinated by maps, right? Is that they imagine themselves to be, you know, the first thing that people look for on a map is where they are. And then the next thing that happens on a map is they imagine where they might be, right? So the idea that people like to think about themselves or find themselves interesting is, like, I think in a world where it's like you can know about anything, the idea that you can know more about yourself is actually really compelling for a lot of people in different kind of ways, right? But I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the things I find interesting about life tracking as a trend. I don't know if I guess you should call it a trend by now. Is that it's almost exclusively, as the way that I say it, is almost exclusively dedicated to fitness, right? This is so it's like it's a management of the self, right? It is a kind of perfectibility, or it's a I don't know if perfectibility is the right word, but these technologies are all being developed around tracking, right? Exercise and this and that, and I had a student a couple of years ago that made the whole class do a fitness logging system over the course of the term, and that was part of her project, was having us like actually interact with this, and And it was interesting to see how many people found it really compelling and like they stayed doing it and they were really, really interested in it. And I never went back. And I still get spam from saying, come back, you haven't been working out. And it's like, no, I just haven't been telling you, and it's this funny thing of like of what that tells you, right, about yourself is I think actually really interesting.
There's two things too. In the collection I did, there's actually an article in there about biomedical tracking, where people who have diseases will give their data to pharmaceutical companies. So they're life tracking as a way to try to find a cure for something.
Right.
So they would understand themselves as being part of a greater social mission. On the other hand, it's a little bit like what John Locke says. They're tracking themselves over time, so they're building a story of illness for themselves, right? I had this much liquid, this much happened, this much came out later. But you also have yourself as a commodity that you are giving away. And I think we have not thought about the ethics of that very much. Pharmaceutical companies love life tracking because they can get data for free.
Well, one of the things that's amazing about what's happening now, in all sorts of ways, we are providing information that allows all sorts of organizations, including ourselves, to surveil each other.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting thing about the life tracking, right? Is that somehow when it becomes, the heart rate monitor, that's more invasive, right? But when it's my browsing history or something else, it's not seen as the same level. We don't have the same kind of alarm bells that go off around privacy, right? So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in that sense, in terms of shedding light on the kinds of practices that they might make us a bit queasy sometimes, but there isn't the same kind of sense of like, whoa, that's
like the controversy about Google Glass, which I know you want to ask us about, has to do with the facial recognition software capability that it's supposed to eventually have, where you could use that to identify all your business contacts, or in my case, my students, my thousands of students, I can remember their names. But it could also be used for surveillance really easily. So what are we going to do? How close is that to our heart, literally, right, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But it's not just Google Glass is sort of the future, but there's that device that came out of Microsoft Labs that it's a little digital camera. You put it around your neck. It has a motion detector, and somebody moves in front of you, it snaps a picture. So and then you can upload this. So you can sort of keep a visual record of your life. I think Ted Nelson is also interested in these things. And in this case, you're not tracking yourself, you're now tracking everyone who comes into some sort of counter, which gets back to the ethical issues. What is the etiquette, the ethics? You look like you want to...
No, you're talking about just going back before raising the issue of privacy, about the life tracking. So I see some use in monitoring your health and other aspects. I think the big impact is going to be around sharing experiences. Something is more transient. So think of photos. In the old days, they were in the album. That was a life tracking device. Now the whole meaning and use of photos changed dramatically. And I'm using it to share an experience as it happens. Right? I mean the Oilers game versus the Canucks. The Oilers are 7-2 up. Taking a picture of the scoreboard and sharing with my friends in Vancouver, right? That time. So all of these tracking devices capture my current experience more richly. I think about this more and more transit way. I think that's what the big impact is going to be, because people like to capture and share their experiences.
And this gets back to what Dr. Engel was talking about, this idea of place where people are personalizing. In some sense, we're scratching our own graffiti on the sort of wash of information. We're adding our own little, here, I'm here too. So let me actually move us to a question here. I think a couple of you were talking about how systems produce different types of users and identities. How structures, can you give me an example of that? Or can you, I think you were arguing that we inherited a very European idea of identity, and that's been inscribed or encoded right into the system.
Yeah, someone I didn't mention, but who is really influential for this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the architect of both the document, The Social Contract, and who also wrote the first contemporary autobiography. And there's an argument about him that actually the personal document is the social contract, the one that's about politics and citizens, and the political document is his life story. And the reason why I'm saying that is he really thought each individual in a society gives some of their rights to the state, right? And the state in response is going to protect you. But you can still stay an individual, but you give away some things. That's pretty foundational to how we understand identity right now. And so that kind of way of saying we keep some things for ourselves, or we're not always sure how much we're keeping, and we give some things away to something else for another purpose, that's really foundational to Western ideas of the self. So here's an example, which is Facebook. Facebook, every time the interface changes, I've noticed that users really get upset about it, right? Even though it's a corporate product, right? But they don't, most people who use Facebook don't think about it like that. They think about it as a communication engine that is public and that lets them do, lets them communicate things to the world. But Facebook has a lot of affordances in it that create a certain sense of what yourself is going to be. It's always asking you how you feel today, or tell us a story, right? There's always the status line that you're supposed to report doesn't just say status line, it's inviting you to share something. And in fact, if you're not on Facebook for a while, just like with those, Fitbit sites, it'll ask you to come back. Mm-hmm. It's trying to make, in other words, it's trying to draw you out. It's trying to make you share. And over, the inventor of Facebook, Mark, what's his name? International Television, I had forgotten his poor man's name, has,
not poor man.
Yeah. not in the monetary sense in any way. But he says people want to share. Well, that's what he decided. Is he sure? So he's making us possibly into, if you're on the site, you participate in his idea of what identity is. You may be able to change some of it, but you are participating, and you are subject to the design in that sense. It has rules. Why do you have a biography section on Facebook? But you do. You shouldn't have to. You share so much stuff, but there is. There's a section where you even have more information about yourself, right? So the ethic of sharing is something that, that goes back to Rousseau. He says that's how a state works. Everybody gives away something to get something. So that's as much as I should say about that. That's my example.
Over. Do you have thoughts on that?
Definitely the affordances, what the system allows you to do and what it doesn't shapes how you present yourself and form the identity. Am I allowed to attach a picture? Am I forced to attach pictures as part of my profile? So there's no question that there's some decisions made by the designers, some notions of what identity is and what communication is that are embedded into the system. I don't like Facebook, so maybe I should say it to the camera here, talking about the digital. I'm not using Facebook, right?
But it's also, I think it's just as important though to at the same time recognize the ways in which users generate the culture of the space that they inhabit at the same time, right? So that, it's always already a dynamic relationship, right? It's the encoding decoding relationship. To go back to Stuart Hall, that there's a sense that the design of a system will enact requirements on the one hand, absolutely, but then users, right? They do different things, right?
Especially in communities with sort of corporate setting, right?
Exactly, and that becomes also, I think, a really important component. So, if you imagine, if you're a good Facebooker, right, as I call them, well, no, but it's true, right?
Yeah.
But if you're an active participant in Facebook, one of the things that is that there are different kind of zones of activity in your Facebook world that are attached to different communities of people. And those different communities of people have different ways of interacting with that system, right? So that there is, the group that is, that sees the status update as the principal method of interaction on Facebook, right? There is the category of people who see the photo as the principle, right? There's a clear age distinction between those two groups, right? Like the way that my 14-year-old nieces use Facebook is entirely different. Like it's a completely different culture, right, than the way that I use Facebook or friends of my age use Facebook, right? So that dynamic is also really important, I think, to keep in mind, right? That we have systems that incite behaviors, but then we also have these agents who do things both according to those systems, but also brushing up against them, right? And that tension is always what keeps the system ticking over.
A good example of that can change, where the system itself changes, would be World of Warcraft, which was designed as a fantasy role-playing game, but really is a gigantic community. And from what I know about players of World of Warcraft, and if you're out there, please write us and talk to us, is that after a while, you realize you can't win the whole game, right? Someone's always going to be better than you, just like offline life, I guess. And so what becomes more important are the relationships that you're building, right? In the stuff that I've read about World of Warcraft, that becomes equally or even more important than the game, which means the game is changing because the users are changing it, right? Yeah.
I think the successful platforms or systems are the ones that involve the users, right? And Lego is one example of co-creation and user involvement. You let the users change the systems, you involve them as part of the design.
Yeah.
And you see this in the online communities happening all the time, in online games. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm reminded of how hard it is to die in the digital world. My mother, who loved Facebook, recently passed away, and I have filled out the form to memorialize. But as far as I can tell,
She's still alive?
she's the website is still up. There's no response. It's going to be very interesting. I'm tempted to go in. I'm tempted to go. I have the passwords to go in and sort of say, sorry, I'm no longer around. But that seems inappropriate too.
How can you text from beyond the grave?
Exactly. Well, I could start a whole other life. Let me talk a little bit about culture here, since that is the sort of topic, and we've led into it from identity here.
Yeah.
So can we talk about digital culture at all, or is it digital cultures, or is the digital really just irrelevant? Are there just different subcultures? Who'd like to sort of tackle that big one?
Well, I would start by saying that I think that the error as we approach a question like that would be to think that there is something out there that we can think of as being culture or think of as being digital, right? Because we're embedded. We're always already embedded, right? So the digital is the world. The world is the digital. The idea of that distinction between real life and a digital world is, I think, no longer tenable. Really, at some level, there is in any life some kind of overlap, some kind of merging where that distinction becomes untenable. So I think one of the difficulties of a question like that is the idea that there is a kind of object that we think of as culture, right? And I think that cultural studies taught us that we live culture. Culture is our lives. It's not a thing that we look at. And so that would always be for me the starting point of thinking through what digital culture is. Would be thinking through how we live our lives in the digital, because that's what culture arises from.
Okay, this is a good start. I mean, one way to think about that, and that would be from Raymond Williams. He said culture is a way of life. That's what it is. It's a whole way of life. It's a whole way, everything that's in there. So in that sense, there is digital culture, and there are subcultures within it that would operate within it, which would relate to other forms of culture. I would think that's what you're saying, and I think that would make sense to me too. I'd want to know what the difference was between digital and analog culture. Like, would there be one? I kind of think there would be, if we thought about that. It might have to do with speed. It might have to do with the way we understand spatial relations. It might have to do with what languages we're using. Because to me, English has become such a lingua franca in the online world, except in certain applications. And so is that really true everywhere in digital cultures? Do people not speak other kinds of machine languages instead? And so to me, I'm not always sure how to answer the question in the big sense, but I would tend to agree with Mo that we really have, that the way that we express ourselves in the online representational universe is culture. But it does have rules, and it does have trajectories and histories and all those things, and we're just beginning to figure out what they are. So that would be my really all over the place answer.
Ofer.
Yes.
Yes.
I agree.
That's it.
But I share the same view. I mean, the culture is what we do is alive, and the digital technologies are everywhere. It's not clear cut before and after. I mean, they're all over the place, and in some areas penetrating more than others, some technologies more than others, and people choose which technologies to adopt. So I don't know if there's a digital and non-digital culture, just alive, right?
But that's it, right? Like I got a picture text message from my mother this morning. How do you categorize that, right? Like, of course that's my real life, right?
Exactly.
But I get it on my phone, asynchronously in the form of, a digital photo that she took of, something, right? And so, I mean, I think that's a great example of like that distinction is spurious most of the time, I think, because that's, that is the life, right?
We could make it a little bit different and say that was Marshall McLuhan right, though? Does the operation of
many things, indeed, he was. Thanks for asking.
Some things I never understand that he says.
Sure.
But one of the things that he does say is that the way that technology operates itself, all by itself, without us, changes us. It changes how we understand before and after. It changes how we understand what countries are. So there has to be. So we can't just say that there's cultural life, and by the way, we have a device that makes some things work faster or differently. Something must be happening to us, to our bodies, to the way we understand ourselves communally when we use devices.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
But
I would also say that dynamic is equally identifiable and active in an analog world, right? And that's the point that I'm trying to make, right? Is that there isn't a kind of pre-digital sanctity, right? That gets to be the original, right? From which we are now, producing, our simulacra, right? There's those dynamics are just as present and just as important, right, to the dynamic of a culture in an analog sense as they are in a digital sense, right? And so the idea that this is somehow different in kind is I think not a fruitful path of inquiry. Different in detail, sure, but different, in the sense of a dynamic, not really.
Well, I think not different in kind, but different in speed and different in quantity. So these are the fundamental different elements. So the amount of interruptions, the ability to do things concurrently. So what we never did it before, but speed and how much we do it.
Yeah. Well, in space too, right? Space collapses, right? So my text from my mother as my example, right, is that it collapses the country, right? No, but it does, right? Like it's one of the things that gets worked, right?
So there seems to be a level to which we're paying a lot of attention now to the digital. I mean, some of what makes the digital different, possibly in kind, is that this is what is getting attention now. When you pick up the newspaper and the magazines and something like that, whatever is, 100 years from now, they may decide that, the telegraph and the newspaper were the greatest acceleration of space and time. The internet is trivial by comparison. But right now, what we're talking about, what we're experiencing, is this thing that goes under this rubric digital. And one of the things that intrigues me about it is that so much of computing discourse is not about what works now. It's about what will be. Like Google, we talked about Google Glass. You know, so much about being up on the digital is about not what you can actually do now, because the things break down. And, you know, the server last night went down. It's about what you're going to be. I want to quote Vannevar Bush here. You know, he sort of says, "As we may think," it's sort of, you know, as we may be, and that's part of the discourse that intrigues me. So this near future. Let me turn back to the issue of private and public, though, because that seems to be another thing that the internet may have changed, of how we construct our private and public selves and understand them. Perhaps you could talk a bit about this.
One thing is that because of the amount of users who are online at any given time, the European and American and North American influenced people, those ideas of public and private are often what get the most airtime, right? And we assume those are the only ones. But a good example of public and private not operating that way would be China, which is making every effort right now to stop certain kinds of technology from influencing their population. Whether that's actually going to happen or not, like whether that will occur, I don't know. But it means that this isn't the only paradigm, and we often think there's only one. So it must be that online life, which is how I understand that, and I don't see that as fundamentally different from offline life, but I think there are some different rules, that the idea about what privacy is evolving very rapidly, but often is connected historically to American privacy law, which was already having difficulty with technology when it was invented, because the problem the privacy law was meant to address was how fast cameras could take pictures of you. So it was really about
and published, and how fast it could be published.
It was about not knowing what to do about the speed of the technology. That was what it was about. And in some way it was like our own bodies couldn't keep up with the technology that we had created. And so privacy law is always lagging behind that stuff of necessity in some ways. So I'll leave it there and see what you guys think about it.
Well, I was just going to throw in, you know, it's also really important to think of those things historically. So, so there is, I mean, I think that, which is not to say that it's not worth thinking through the really difficult nexus of privacy and publicness, or a public presence. But the whole idea of a public-private split is really historically specific, right? I mean, it arises at a particular historical moment that is enabled by, you know, particular other technologies that kind of require that, right? And it's interesting. I mean, I find it really interesting to think back to some of the things Julie was talking about, and to think about the ways in which privacy is also founded on a notion of self-ownership. Right, and I found that I really liked that in what you were talking about, because if we can think in those terms, right, then what we realize is that the threat of a public is a threat of like giving yourself away, right? And what we really need to be doing is like owning ourselves in some kind of way, and that it really is a kind of threat around circulation in some kind of way. So I think it's important to have a kind of historical sense of how those terms work, and then to think through then how are the structures that we're building in a digital age actually challenging, right, that legacy, right, and making us actually recognize, first of all, those structures, but then also how those structures can be messed with, right? And this gets at sort of everything that you're doing, right, which is how the production of these systems is giving yourself away, right? It's giving away your expertise as opposed to your data or yourself. Yep. But it's actually the same dynamic, and yet those are the most compelling and some of the most successful things that are actually happening in the digital world right now are the giveaways, right? Yeah. And that tells us something about ourselves. I think that's really fascinating.
When we talk about the systems, when I think about private and public, I want to take two different places, maybe you didn't intend to questions, but also about the citizens' ability to influence what's happening in the public domain. So through projects that we've done, these technologies, pre-production, and then crowdsourcing technologies, there's environmental monitoring, you see citizens participating in policing and in deciding about the infrastructure of the city, so at the municipal level, the government level, and how can these technologies help us rethink democracy and citizen participation. And so it's not only the dangers of what information is shared into the public domain, but also there's some potential for
So
citizens to be
You're really
involved in the
articulating the radical internet, like the one that I remember hearing about, like in the early 2000s, right? That was invented by people who really believed in radical grassroots democracy, right? And the other one, though, is the surveillance
Yes.
ideas, where there's all this secret stuff that's being compiled that we don't have access to, so it's not public. And those two things are existing online at the same time.
Well, and then I'm intrigued by something that, a word you use, but it's something that I think you've thought about, which is expertise. You know, in some ways, all of us participated in one structure that blessed us or celebrated us or authorized us to be doctors of philosophy, PhDs, to be experts and have some public authority, which is now completely undermined. You know, my Twitter posts don't really count for any more or less than somebody else's Twitter entries and so on like that. How has, and you've been obviously looking at the generation of public knowledge, how have we gone from a culture of expertise to, what is the new form of expertise?
This is an ongoing debate, how much weight should be given to expertise, and pendulum swings from the traditional model of academia and experts have the authority to Wikipedia-based models. Everyone non-experts, and we can have a way to somehow build knowledge and quality control, even though the contributions are made by non-experts. And now the pendulum sort of swings the other way. We see Larry Singer, which worked with Jimbo Wells at Wikipedia, offering now a new model where experts create the encyclopedia. So there's different takes, there's definitely advantages and disadvantages, and you see different systems use different governance schemes in terms of how much weight they allow the non-experts. So I think the debate is going to continue. There's definitely less emphasis on expertise than before, but I don't think it's going away altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and people are really interested in having expertise too, right? So, I mean, that's the other side of that equation, right? So, when you said Twitter, well, all I could think of was cloud scores, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people invest in gaming the system to try to increase their expertise ratings in different systems, right? So it's also like, so people do care about having those things, even at the same time as they're participating in systems that would seem to be much flatter, right? So I find that fascinating.
And this, two different approaches. Take Slashdot. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, and this is based on a reputation model, right? And people gain reputation, and users' ability to filter information is based on the reputation of who posted information.
Exactly.
So although people do not have expertise that are endorsed by some institutions, still they build in the reputation. And then Wikipedia took it made it very flatulous and said, no, we don't want to have any reputation systems. It has to be as flat as possible.
So these are two different structures that almost create two different cultures of expertise. What's interesting is how we have to formalize them. I would say, getting back to your question, what is different between the digital and the analog? We've always had structures, but you have to actually code it into Wikipedia, and we don't always know what we're going to get when we code something.
Also, Wikipedia appears to me, just as a user, to be incorporating some forms of authentication into its system. So you will come across entries where it says this information wasn't verifiable, and they're using what I would understand to be journalistic standards for information, where more than one person has to corroborate something, so that the idea of completely flat systems, there is some reorganization that is going on there, I think, in terms of how that's understood, and I'm interested. I follow that because I'm interested to see what they're going to do, right? How flat can you really stay? Because there is contesting knowledge. So how are you going to decide, right? And a good example would be if you have a religious perspective that says that the earth was created in 6 days, you will write a Wikipedia entry about geology that says that. But if you are, let's say you are a scientist, you're a geoscientist, you will not necessarily agree with that, so who are you going to believe? Like, how do you choose between those narratives, right? And that, to me, is important in those kinds of things.
So there is this notion of governance structure, those flat systems cannot work without, although this system self-organized, there has to be a governance structure, there has to be norms, and Wikipedia works this way.
Right.
There's a way to deal with conflicting opinions and edit words and article get freezing. There's a mediation committee, an arbitration committee, and people get banned. So all this bureaucratic structure underneath that lets you deal with this model that's based on non-experts. Right?
So it's like the UN. You turn into the form of the UN where you all have to come to some kind of consensus, which is what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas says happens in communication, where you have to have norms and you try to agree in terms of what you think logic is, what you think knowledge is, and when you have those agreements, then you can work something out. It sounds like that's what's happening.
Develop consensus based on.
You know, all the governance structures and the consensus building is all happening within the structure. But you have a layer of engineers, if you will, the programmers and the designers, who they have a very different type of say because they're building the structure in the first place. And they're the ones who can, we were talking about how Facebook, you know, they periodically change things when they're not happy with it. World of Warcraft. You log on from you're on a certain server. You can only talk to people who are on that same server.
That's right, because it was made that way.
It was structured that way. How do those of us in the arts and humanities, you know, can we have a dialogue? Can we have some influence on this deep level of governance and engineering, if you will?
I'm sorry, but I want to. One of the things I think it's really important, though, to keep active in our minds is the ways that those systems are also incomplete and imperfect, right? So, I mean, I think that I think we imagine sometimes a kind of invisible hand, right? That there's like these algorithms, and so here's my example that I'd like to think of, and it makes me feel a whole lot better about all of those things that are being collected in the background, which is you can go, a student of mine told me this last year, you can go to Google and you can see who Google thinks you are, right? Because they categorize you and they have your, right? They have your profile. So I did it, and Google thinks I'm an old man. This is my this is my curse. Yeah, Google thinks I'm a retired gentleman. Let's just say. Anyway, but here's what I find refreshing about that is for all of the algorithms that Google is running on the web pages I visit or the searches I do or the whatever, it's so wrong, right? That so I always think about that as the story that makes me feel like, you know, the nefarious undercurrents of what all of this big data mining is actually producing. Maybe it's just really wrong. Maybe it's just really bad, and it's not necessarily the kind of threat that we sometimes think that it can. Yeah. Say Google actually doesn't know me at all. Is the conclusion that I have to come to out of that, you know, which doesn't speak to how we can talk to each other, which I know is your question. But it was as you were framing your question, it was something I thought was really important to bring up. Is that the algorithms are so imperfect, and they're so.
The data is so messy.
The data is so messy, right? Or that I get Christian dating site ads on Facebook all the time, for example, right? And it's like anyone, you know. Well, maybe it's because I'm an old man. No, but I mean, even at the level of, you know, even at the level of a Facebook profile that says that I am in a relationship, the idea that the algorithm somehow still feeds me dating sites, right? So I think it's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Oh. We have a question.
Go ahead, Mom.
No. I was looking to Ofer because you were about to start, and I'm sorry that I interrupted you.
Let's hear from Ofer, and then a question from the floor.
So technology is not neutral. Every technology has an ideology.
That's right.
That the engineers put in. Go back, take the examples of Wikipedia, and I like to use it because this is the exemplar of peer production. The underlying engine, Wiki, comes with a philosophy. In fact, the inventor of the
It's anarchic.
Wiki, Cunningham wrote the book, The Wiki Way, which explains the principles and the ideology behind Wiki. And it was adopted for this pre-production project because the affordancy of the technology allows itself to be used in that context. And one of the interesting things that we're looking at in research is what happens when you take technologies with certain affordances and then you put them in a different context. What happens with corporations take wikis and try to use them for knowledge management internally, and to what extent it conflicts with their perceived ways of managing people and managing knowledge.
So, come on.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting point you brought up, saying that like all the algorithms that are behind Google or whatever the data mining systems can be utterly wrong. But have you like looked at in a different perspective, that because those algorithms are based on whatever the data and the patterns in the data. So the what data they have is basically like I assume that they judge what you are based on the interactions that you are having with the system, and then it's as a way of comparing that one against a general data set.
Mm-hmm.
And would it be possible at all that it classified you as a retired gentleman, because the way that you actually the things that you did with the internet and then all your interactions, and maybe you have so matured and so expertise that will match with a much senior person than you are. And could it be quite possible that not the Google is wrong about you, but actually your evaluation about yourself is actually much more than you are?
What I find interesting about it is, so this is the conversation that I had with the student who pointed me to this in the first place, I find really fascinating, because her deal is this. She's like, I tell Google everything, because then Google gives me better stuff, right? That's her thing, right? So I get better ads, it refers me to better things, my searches, like when I search for things, I get better results. It's like, so she lets Google track whatever they want with it, right? I'm a much more resistant, right, Google user. I would let Google know some things. I browse incognito a lot of the time. I do, right? Like
You're an old man user.
I'm a differently, well, I don't know that old men are necessarily that good at that. But the sites that I don't care about being tracked on, I don't know, like I go to NHL.com a lot. I don't know if that's what it is. But I think the idea that those profiles, I think the thing that I'm trying to get at is the idea that those profiles are actually reliable, right? I think is the issue, right? So I don't doubt that the algorithm has matched me up with something, right? But if it continues to believe that I'm a retired man, okay, so it thinks I'm 67, just so we can have a, okay, so if it continues to think that I'm like a 67-year-old man, then it tracks me as though I'm a 67-year-old man, and I keep reinforcing the algorithm, right? Like that's what I'm trying to get at, right? Is that once I'm in that loop, right, I perpetuate that loop in a way that that actually makes that whole system less reliable, right? With every passing piece of data that it feeds back into the system, and so that's what I find interesting about the whole kind of Big Brother algorithmic data mining thing that we really worry about, is that when the systems are wrong, they then continue to become more wrong, right? As they go down the same path, and that's something that I think is really worth thinking about.
I totally agree. That is basically you are trying to build. If you talk in terms of the technical terms, it's what you are trying to do is that like a positive reinforcement. So it's going to be reinforced based on a wrong judgment.
Exactly.
But my general sense is that like all these things doesn't have the same priority or the same weight. So the main goal of the Google is to provide you a better experience than I mean. I'm not saying they are successful, but I'm saying that can be their goal. So whether they are successful with the goal is or not is a different issue. But so the goal of these data mining techniques is to give you a better experience. That's a goal, and then there are priorities. my point is that answering the question of like who am I? Like I don't think answering that question had that much of an importance or the higher priority than for that data mining or that engine to answer the general questions that I am about to ask, for example. So the point is, what I'm thinking is that like asking the question, who am I? Letting Google decide who am I would say that's kind of an attractive thing that somebody came up, but it might not be the primary objective of the data mining based engine, profiling engine. The profile might have been optimized to provide better results for me.
Right.
But somebody was
so-
interested in a question,
Yes.
letting the data mining engine to answer a question, who am I, which is not the real thing to it's trained to do, I would say.
Right.
And so that's why I thought that maybe it's just that like it's answering your needs rather than finding out who you are.
Yeah.
So we have another question from.
Yes, I have question and comment at the same time. It's interesting how everything is connected, like identity, space, and organization. So internet represents kind of separate state, virtual state. And also it's nice to hear that we always associate internet like something originally Western phenomena with Western values of liberty, freedom of speech, choice, comfort, personality on the top. But what we see in online world today, it's nothing close to comfort. Huge flows of information that we don't choose. It's not our choice to see all that. Also, highly moderated and controlled websites, a lot of other things. So, and also people refer to personalities and individuals in the internet like products. But when you think about the product, what comes to mind is something that does not form itself, it doesn't manage itself. It's something creative, something final. And if people and identities online are products, so next question is, who are those product managers?
That's
and
right.
if there are product managers, so they have power and influence to influence you and to create ideology. And someone, for example, in case of conflicts in Syria and other countries, people were telling that, oh, Facebook and Twitter, they give voice to many, many people who were against, but there were a lot of other people who were against what was happening. And but who did we hurt most? We hurt those who were just against, not against the against. So the question is, are we really identities and individuals online, or are we products? And who are those product managers? Are they willing to hear something that they don't like, or just your opinion about it?
Wow, these are fantastic comments. And they speak a little bit to this discussion here as well. Because is the problem you're giving the wrong data or you're asking the wrong questions? Is a system expecting something from you that you're not giving to it, right? Which in the case clearly is happening. And in this case, do we only see the intelligible side of an issue, right? So Western people like to think that there's going to be this group of people in Syria and here's what they look like because they look like us enough, right? So that we can understand what they're saying. But there's these other people that are not in the system, are not part of that intelligibility. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah. And to me, I want to say that both things can happen because I believe with Dr. Engel that the work of people exceeds the systems and the controls set for it very often, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have online life be the open system that it can be, right? So I want to say that. At the same time, I would say that you're right. One of the problems I see with the continuous and ongoing corporatization of the internet is that we are beginning to have a very limited idea of what a product is, and that we are beginning to think of ourselves as consumers who are marketed to, instead of thinking that we are producers and that we make things. So to me, I really like your questions on that. They're way too complex for me to answer right here or even think about, but I like what you're getting at. with
No,
that
no,
kind of problem.
I love the idea of thinking of how we manage our online presences as being our brand managers. I think that's great. I think that's how I'm going to teach it now. I'm going to like how do you, how do you manage, when you try to teach a kind of critical approach to how you manage yourself online, right? How do you manage what you put out there online? Thinking of it as being like your own brand manager is actually quite fantastic in that sense. I like that a lot.
So I want to bring us back to this question of what agency we have, what we can do. I set it up earlier in a way that none of you really bit, the sort of engineers versus humans. And you probably didn't bite because it's not that simple, of course. So I'm going to try to ask it a different way. What do we want to enable through the design of the digital? This is not a fixed thing. This is a moving thing. This symposium is an experiment. What do we want to enable? And I know you've done a lot of projects over. What were you trying to enable? What forms of organization and production were you trying to make possible?
I was trying to enable human agency and collective action in ways to give citizens power to influence what's happening in the public sphere. This is at the municipal level or the high level of governments. We had some projects with the city when we wanted the citizens to get involved in influencing decision about investments in infrastructure for transportation, where it allows for the LRT and the paths.
I've been following that. That's great.
And other projects involve citizen-based environmental monitoring, giving people the ability to monitor pollution, whether this is air pollution, water pollution, finding ways to make it easy so we can reach beyond the small group of people that are, traditionally the activists, and everyone can take part of it. As easy as, use the iPhone, take a picture, we see pollution, upload it. So different ways, and when we do involve citizens, how can we build, it's not only the technological infrastructure, it's also the social infrastructure, because these are social technical systems, right? So when we have all of these contributions from the citizens, how do we organize them? How do we, quality control, these are the social processes and water moderators. So these are the kind of questions that I'm trying to do.
How about, what do you want to see from design enablement?
I think that in the work that I do, and the work that my immediate collaborators do in the Pipelines project, I think we really want to enable people to understand a lived relation to place, and that place most immediately is Edmonton, because that's what we mostly focus on. And so to create the kind of affordances that allow people to imagine their relationship to a place being different than the story they've been told about that place, right? So the reality of a city like Edmonton and the history of a city like Edmonton being actually significantly different than the story of the place, right? And being able to place ourselves in that narrative and in that history in a different way, and to recognize that we all, in inhabiting this place, change it and produce it, right? And to then provide the tools that would allow people to produce that space as they inhabit it. So to first of all be able to see that and to recognize that dynamic and to recognize the deep narrative of place that is already here, but then to actually have the capacity and the tools to write themselves into that story at the same time.
More, can you break it into specific system features? Like, what kind of features do you think would enable capturing that rich experience in an online computerized system?
Well, so, I'm trying to, so one of the projects that one of my colleagues works on is called Vertical Suburbia. And what they do is they crowdsource stories about the suburbs And so they have to be 140 words long, they're accompanied by a photo, they get pinned onto the maps. And the idea is, there's one conceit that holds all of the stories together, which is that we live in a world that imagines that the suburbs are horizontal and flat. And so the challenge for the stories is to look up and look down and not look across. And so to tell the story of something vertical in the suburbs. And so then these stories get collected, and the idea is that the suburbs are actually much more complex and much more interesting than the conventional narrative of the suburbs would allow, right? And so by writing those stories, you actually enrich that narrative, right? You make that narrative more complex, right?
And, you know, to some extent, archives have also served, you know, people being able to leave behind the traces such that a story could be rewritten,
Yeah.
could be re-understood,
Yeah.
something like that. It's
Yeah.
not something new to the digital.
Yeah.
But,
Or here's a quick and easy example of one of the things that we do in a number of the projects that we work on, which I love, is overlaying historical photos on contemporary photos
Oh,
of
yeah.
particular places, right? And so that
I've seen that.
yeah, and so we call them sliders, and then what you can actually do is you can actually pull the edges of the photo across the right. So it gives you this sense of like the simultaneity of place, right? To go back to that Foucault to say, you know, anybody who has, you know, so Vintage Edmonton has become this big thing on Facebook, right? It's all these historical photos. They're mostly from the 70s, but they're also from other moments. And you think, right, like the next thing to be able to do is to actually like literally overlay those, right, onto contemporary places, and have this sense of like that's what that place is. That place is this, but it is also that historical moment, and it's also this historical moment. And to have those kinds of historical layers laid over things is one of the affordances of the digital that you just can't get that in any other way, right? I mean, maps are also a great way to do that, right? To have historical maps laid over more contemporary maps, right? You realize the completely different technologies we use to delineate space.
So we have 5 minutes left.
Oh my goodness.
And what I want to talk about, I've got 2 questions for you. One is about failure. I want us to spend a moment thinking about, you know, what fails, how do we handle fail, does the system degrade gracefully or something like that? And then actually, I want to, at the very end, I want to go around and I want to get your sense of, you know, how has the internet affected scientific and academic production? And you could even reflect on, you know, that this experiment itself is an experiment in scientific and academic production. So failure and production.
Which may be the same thing.
Well, so far it hasn't
Okay.
been, thanks to Claire and company. So Ofer, do you want to start us off on this?
Okay, I speak to the notion of failure. So what we're seeing is that change in the way we perceive failure and allowing failure in as part of first the design system, but also the process for design systems. So the whole new approaches for developing software, the agile and rapid extreme, are all about consecutively more and more interactions. We allow failure, so we don't try to get it perfect first hand and then we keep changing it. And I'll go not to specific technology again, wiki technology. If you look at the design principles that they have, one of them is error tolerant. So the notion that you make small changes in small increments and allow people to keep revising that, that is the way of arriving quality product, quality content, rather than trying to make it perfect first of all. So I think we're seeing a different approach with systems that are error tolerant.
I just think immediately of games, right? Like I just think about you know one of the great models for systems that people want to engage with is as the game, and then failure. You know, it goes back to McGonagall, right? Failure as built into the system, right? And so the tolerance for failure actually being something that we find really compelling in trying to solve problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how we solve problems. We solve problems by failing and iterating, right? And then and failing and iterating and failing and iterating and we. I think, too frequently live in a world that is intolerant of failure.
Yeah.
So I think that's something really that the digital world is maybe one of the lessons it can teach us more of, right? Which is like we're always troubleshooting, we're always working around, we're always, right? Like tolerance of failure is built into the system so much that I think it's an important lesson we can take from it.
Well, I want you all to know that we can go back, before we archive this video, we can go back and anything you said that was wrong, go back and edit it.
Love it, yeah.
It's interesting, somebody said that, one of the problems of graduate school is it disciplines you to never be wrong.
Right?
So you keep your trap shut unless you can speak with authority. And also you enter the digital world, which is about this iteration and play.
I also think that the consequences for failure, let's say in the academic systems, are so great.
Mm-hmm.
So if you fail a course, it's always on your transcript. It's like your mother having an afterlife. It never leaves you. Whereas in these models, you can try something, it doesn't work, you try something else, right? This is actually basic scientific inquiry, right? Where you let yourself be wrong, But the other part is the part of play, right? I can't help thinking, at the beginning of the 20th century, people used to build their own cars. There were all these tiny companies in Canada that built their cars, and they figured out how to build really excellent cars. But then in the era of mass production meant that only certain companies got to build cars, right? So there's just Ford, and there's Chevrolet or whatever. And there's only a few, and all these other little experimental things die. So what I don't want to see when I'm thinking about digital culture is an environment where a few corporations get to say what success and failure are.
Mm.
I want it to be all these little nodes where people are trying stuff and they do stuff right, and sometimes they do it wrong, and they figure out, because that's in the cracks there, that's where the light comes in, right? That's where we understand what the limits of the system are. And so that's what I would love to be able to see, that instead of monolithic systems that we always seem to be building that are going to have problems. So that's what I'd say there.
Well, Stephen Jay Gould talks about, now he's talking about biological diversity, but he talks about punctuated equilibrium. You have periods during which diversity, variety grows, and then you have these die-offs. And around optical technologies, we saw in the late 19th century, we saw this sort of explosion of optical technologies, and then the Pathé brothers sort of get an economic model in cinema that you see a die-off. When was the last time you saw a diorama or a panorama or any of these other optical technologies? Maybe what the university can be is a space where even if there is some sort of die-off and a lessening of diversity, there's still a space for experimentation, and we can give our students and our colleagues, and through citizen science, we can give the community spaces for continuing to experiment. And I think on that note, I'm going to say that I've just had the last word. So I'd like to.
That's fair.
I really want to thank you for a fascinating conversation, which I think we could actually continue quite helpfully. I think next up on the program is going to be, we have the Innovation in Pedagogy Summit coming from the University of Virginia, which is going to run for 2 hours. Then we have Texas A&M with a program coming from the Initiative for Digital Humanities, Media, and Culture. After that, we go to some talks coming from the University of Lethbridge, then York, Tokyo, and Sydney. This keeps on going. I'll be there until the bitter end, 10 o'clock, twittering away. So thank you again to our speakers, and that's it for the U of A panel.